All righty. You didn't think we'd stop there. We still got 6 pages left.
Welcome back, Patriots.
Welcome back. We're going to be wrapping this chapter up today. And it's going to be a little bit before we go into the reason section. I'm going to be away for a while. But we will get there. We're going to get this whole book done, even if it takes the rest of the year. No matter how long it takes, we're getting this whole thing done. And no matter how grueling it's going to be, we're going to get it done. So we kind of we did go over this page last time, of course. This little last paragraph that I wrote here, it's a little complicated. It's a little, it's very abstract. But when Hegel's writing, he's a little, he becomes poetic at times with what he's saying, and it can make it difficult to really get to the sort of concrete understanding of what he's talking about. And then I think part of that is just the fact that he's trying to be poetic. Maybe I'm just guessing here, but maybe because the content of this is so abstract that it's hard to explain it without alluding to a sort of relation, like a dramatic relationship, to make it more contextual, I suppose, or to make it more digestible, I should say. But for example, here, I'll just read this briefly, and then I'll try to make it as simplistic as possible for the sake of the audience, because this was, when I was going through this and taking notes, one paragraph would take like 20 minutes to analyze. This is no joke. So if you're struggling with this, don't feel bad about it. For me to get through this entire chapter, to do the notes, that is, it took me it was a full work week worth of studying. The only reason I was able to do that was because I did have a week vacation, and I just used all that time to work on this because I knew that I would not have time otherwise to do so. But anyways, I don't want to digress too much. I think we're just going to hop right into this, and I just want to kind of go over this one more time because it's gonna be important for the rest of this, of course. So, and I'm going to be reading the last paragraph. Actually, I'll read the sort of second to last paragraph and the last paragraph here. So the thanks it gave has now become ungrateful in a sense, in its canceling out of its work and its focus on it meaning the universal form from which it stemmed. Inherent to relation 3 is its undermining of the truth of 2, but if so, then 3 cannot truly be. In 2, it is what demonstrates the independence, but in doing so, in 3, the means through which the independence can be, or distinction, is denied. But if so then is its unchangeableness, which is itself as universal, individual. 1 alienates itself from its universal in its focus on the concrete reality, seemingly divorced from that of the unchangeable universal. Yet it still, in its unhappiness, needs it. 3 alienates itself from the universal, in that in its return to it denies its self-expression as null, but in doing so, this denies its essence as universal, which is this alienation present from the other side. And as soon as it thinks it's grasped it in its return, it has lost it. 3 is the logic of 1 and 2, but it is the failure of 1 just at a higher level in 3. In 1, it knows itself as individual in relation to universal, but cannot grasp it, so it feels alienated, even though it knows it exists. And this knowing latent within alienation is its devotion to it. Knowing that it is alienated, it expresses itself in work and enjoyment. This is the grasping of its identity through which it sees that unity of self reflected outwardly, and now in 3 gives thanks to the unchangeable universal from which it gives its unity. But it then renunciates this gratitude as it looks back at its individual expression as inferior, as it was granted and not essential or prime, and in doing so wants to throw it away and be one with the universal, unchangeable. But the very act of doing this, and what seems like getting closer to the unity, in its return, it actually ends up alienating itself again, but from the other side. So what does all this mean, right? Because Hegel, when we talk about the unhappy consciousness, let's start there. in life, right, our experience of our concrete existence is the constant self-distinguishing or self-division of ourself through time, right? I kind of talked about this multiple times. You last week, in some sense, is not the same you as today. Those are two different versions of yourself, if you will. But there's one thing there that remains the same, the unity of identity, of the very fact that you can say, well, me last week and me this week and me next week, right? There's that me is still the same, but nonetheless, it's also not the same because it's divided between those weeks. And of course, this goes all the way down to the level of instantaneous immediacy moments or whatever. And the unhappy consciousness recognizes this sort of contradiction. Okay, there is me that is this one thing that I can predicate in all these different instances of myself, but then these different instances of myself are actually my real experience of my own unity. But in that experience, I sort of can never grasp my fullness, my unchangeable essence, the sort of static self that's always there, even though, you know, I know it must be there in order to have this divided existence through space and time and in moments or whatever. But I can never actually get that as such. I can only sort of infer from my existence through time and space that unity exists, that static unity exists. But and this is the unhappy consciousness. It almost becomes, you could say, anxious because it wants to sort of bridge this gap. Um, Now, the interesting thing is that so in the first relation of that, it identifies with that sort of its concrete, immediate experience of this division through time, and it sort of uh, you know it identifies with that, but it also recognizes the unchangeable as essential. Later on, it kind of begins to believe that its expression through space and time, even though it identified with that in the first, that expression, because it is sort of begotten by this unity of itself, it kind of takes it as inferior. Uh, Now, interestingly, or sorry, maybe I might have misspoke here. Uh, well, and then in two, right? It seems to be doing a similar thing, but in three, it then sees its own unity once again, uh, in its own work and enjoyment, right? Because when it makes something, it produces something. It sees, oh well, this thing that I produce is a reflection of my identity, and my identity is a unity because it is a one identity distinct from other identities. And then in doing that, it does the same thing that it did in one, and that it over identifies with its own unity and wants to ignore its division through space and time, so to speak. Um, but what distinguishes one and two is that in one, uh, it's doing this just by the basis of the fact of its own inferring from its own sort of experience through space and time, whereas in the latter three, it's doing this based on the fact that it's what's it called, that it can see its unity in its work and enjoyment. So it's kind of a more matured denial of uh, its existence through like manifoldness or division, kind of from a different perspective. They're both flawed. They're flawed because they ignore the truth of the fact that um, in order for one to exist, the other must exist. The unity of self cannot exist unless it's a unity through through its own manyness, its own division. Just like a universal can't exist without its particular. This is sort of Hegelian logic, and that's what he's getting at with this. Um, so that's sort of, and I'm trying to break down how these relations work, how one is distinguished from two and from three. So the interesting, and it's worthwhile to go over two again, I would say. Let me just see here. Um, yeah, in two, let's see. In two, it is what demonstrates the independence, but in doing so, in three, the means through which the independence can be distinction is denied. But if so, then its unchangeableness, which is itself, is universal, individual. Yeah. So in two, maybe if we go back a little bit for a moment here, let's see. Yeah, so two is actually the second relationship of its knowledge of independence made real and actual through work and enjoyment, which stems from that desire latent in the unhappy first relation of or feeling of alienation from its unity of self. This leads to work and enjoyment therein as the active externality of the concrete individual. So that way he has a window into his independence. Through this and the recognition he has seen his independence, and in seeing this, he knows he's not merely an abstract, unchangeable, but has concrete existence and actuality. It is in that actual expression he knows his unity. This his unchangeable must really be. And through the other has returned into himself. In this return into himself, it is again faced with the enemy. Through the acknowledgement of its own independence, which was found in the other, it returns into itself as knowing of itself, having unity, and is again the recognition of the unchangeable. But here, in this recognition of the unchangeable, it forgets its concrete presence in the actual and cancels it out after getting confirmation of its independent existence as such. Um, let's see here. So yeah, basically in two is where it does begin to see itself its own independence, but it's in that third relation after it realizes its independence through work and enjoyment that it then denies um its existence, so to speak, in um in a divided sense through space and time. Now, frankly, I want to be a little bit more precise. I say deny. I don't want to say deny because it's not as if the unhappy consciousness is saying that doesn't exist, but it's saying that its existence through space and time, its divided sort of being is inferior to the unchangeable essence and unnecessary, contingent, so to speak. But for Hegel, it's not contingent in the sense of like um, that one logically is prior to the other. It's more so that both they're contingent upon each other. They exist symbiotically, and as far as they are contingent for each other, or contingent in relation to one another, you could also argue that they're necessary in relation to one another. This necessarily implies this, and that necessarily implies that. And in doing so, that means they are both dependent upon one another. But uh, you could also look at it that way as well. So with that out of the way, I just wanted to kind of clear that up, simplify it, just so when we're going forward here, because we're going to move on to a sort of second section. So, well, not a second section, but like another development from all this that's kind of going to wrap up everything we're going into here. Actually, there is a little bit more here that I probably actually left out, so I'll read this now too because it's relevant. The universal, in order to be, must be so over its individual mediated form. It must exist relationally, but if its relation is denied, then it loses its essence and becomes void. The logic here then means that the universal becomes lost from the attempt to grasp it without its otherness. And this denial of otherness, which has its independence from making it really distinct in identity, thus destroys its identity, and once again produces this alienation. Identity needs individuality. It needs to be itself and not other. But for this to be the case, the other must exist actually. And the denial of one leads to the denial of the other. This is not merely the inner movement of self consciousness, but the more qualified movement of the unhappy consciousness, of which is present in self consciousness's development. So, and you're going to see this, right? So, Hegel's constantly saying throughout all these sections, we saw this in the preface, we saw this in the introduction, we saw this in Sense Certainty, we're seeing it here, and we're going to keep seeing it as we go on. That whenever a shape of consciousness privileges one side of being over the other, it's undeveloped because any particular thing is inherently relational. That's why Hegel says the essence of the object, or if we want to put it in another way, the essence of a particular thing is to have its own being in itself, meaning its own sort of implicit existence or having its own identity as such, distinct from other things, but also at the same time being related to other things. Because if you're distinct from other things, you are in some way, well, you are related to those things from which you are distinct by the very fact that you are distinct. To say I am this and not that implies a relation from this to that. That these two things are not each other is a relation, and every object has that as its essence, um, which we saw kind of laid out, I believe, in the introduction. No, actually, I'm sorry. In Sense Certainty, he did say that. Um, so, sorry, one second. Let me just mute my phone. Of Every time I record these, the entire world decides to just blow up my phone. It's really ridiculous. It's like I never anytime I wanna do something serious, the entire world wants to call me. Anyway, um, continuing on here. In its denial of its individual expression, its presence in work and enjoyment, which is the individuated form, and his essential being, these individuals become mere particularities, since in their denial they no longer refer to anything universal, and thus they become self-imploding in a way. In their expression, taken to be inferior, they are seen as imperfect, alienated from the perfect, akin to the imperfect many in relation to perfect unity, or sin as the lacking of unity with God. It is therefore considered wretchedness in the face of this universal, unchangeable unity. The enemy, or alienation, in its seeming defeat, is actually its reaffirmation. As consciousness is fixated with the inferiority of individuality in the face of universality, it reaffirms the tension from the other side. As Hegel puts it, quote, a personality brooding over itself. In this fixation on the defilement that is the individual, it alienates itself from the universal, even though its intention is the opposite. It undermines the very way in which the universal can exist, as that which is beyond all its particularity, as its own living expression. In denying its living expression, it denies the universal without knowing, and this alienation is latent within. Its denial of individuality cuts it off from the universal, making it shut in, close off particularity, funnily enough. So this is interesting, right? Basically, what Hegel is saying here is that uh, when consciousness becomes fixated on grasping this unchangeable unity of self, right? When it says do away with all the me throughout space and time and my existence in immediacy, just give me the essence of myself, that one particular unity of self that's transcends any particular instantiation. Uh, in doing that, be, it actually alienates itself further from what it wants. Why? Because in order to actually have that unity that it's seeking so bad, it necessarily entails that it has that divided existence or manifold existence, as Hegel may put it. Because to be universal is to be the universal beyond all particularity. A universal doesn't exist in a void, it's inherently relational. But if you cut off its relational essence, you're therefore cutting off what it is to be universal. Um, so that's what he's getting at now. So it's a really funny thing. It's in this attempt to run away from multiplicity in favor of this unity, you're actually running away from the unity, because the unity needs this multiplicity. If you really wanted the unity, the wise thing to do would be to acknowledge the multiplicity, which affirms the truth of the unity, right? So you actually get what you want through affirming its opposite, so to speak, through affirming its other. Because by the very fact that something else is other than it implies that it exists and is a unity that has its own existence. Um, but this unhappy consciousness, because it is not matured, it doesn't realize this yet. It doesn't realize that one-sided being, so to speak, a preference for this one side specifically without recognition of the other, um, actually it undermines its own existence. Today I put a video out, funnily, on the antisocial, and I was inspired to make that video from reading this chapter. And there's a section in that video titled the antisocial psychotic self-destruction, or something along those lines. And the point that I was making is that the antisocial, because its essence is to destroy everybody else around itself, um, if it does destroy everybody else around itself, it ceases to exist, because its existence as this negating thing, so to speak, is contingent upon something to negate. But because that is the case, and it doesn't recognize that it needs the other to be itself, if it destroys what it needs for its own existence, then it can't exist. But its essence is to do that, is to destroy its own conditions which allow it to exist. And that is the same thing going on here with the unhappy consciousness, running away from the conditions of what allows what it wants to exist, and that's what Hegel's getting at here. Um, so just continuing on here, so actually, before I read this, I will give an even more easier way to understand this. I mean, in the Christian, story, God, right? Well, like turning your face away from God, so to speak, uh, and alienating yourself from God, of course. It actually, and you would do that because you would think that I don't need God because I can have my own existence unto myself and be my own person, and live anarchistically, if you will. Um, but in doing that, you undermine your actual ability to be an independent thing because your independent existence is, of course, inherently related to God's independent existence. Um, Now, this isn't to say that Hegel's logic is inherently Christian or something like that, but it's there is a similarity there, in that.
So what would be in place of God here?
Well, it's really not like, what he's talking about here is essentially, when the human subject wants to understand itself, its first instinct is to understand itself as a unity instead of understanding itself as this thing which exists through, um, a divided life through moments, years, months, weeks, experiences. It doesn't want to deal with all that because it's too, like, almost too complicated for it. It's too much to deal with. So it instead pivots towards this. Oh, okay. Well, I'm just Gabriel, right? And I'm not me in New York City this week and uh, New Jersey last week, or any of those things. I view myself as this one thing. Um, but the problem is that, first of all, the one thing that I want cannot exist unless I have this divided existence, because the essence of that oneness is to be relational to the sort of existence through space and time. And yeah, so that's what he's specifically talking about. Um, and if you're, and I guess if you want to sort of compare it to Christianity, right? If you're like, if you're an individual person and you sort of say, "Oh, I don't want God, because it's getting in the way of myself," your your desire is paradoxically, contradicting itself in a certain sense, because you can't have yourself without having that, relation to the universal, so to speak, because you're treating
So
yourself as the universal.
analogous to God is the dissipation of the individual within the plethora of experience throughout the course of his life.
Well, not necessarily the dissipation per se, although you could say that, like, it's more so just uh like that unity underlying that, multiplicity. But saying that, but if you were to treat yourself, the human person, as essential and non-relational to God or whatever, something that's not derived from God, in doing that, because you want your own sense of self, you would actually be sort of, um, contradicting that desire without realizing it, because you cannot actually have a self without that universal God, so to speak.
What would you call like the opposite of the illusion of the individual, like the static individual?
Like, are you talking about, like, in the example that I gave with God, or just in general?
I'm talking about like with regards to how Hegel describes like the way a person changes over time and so on and so forth, and how it
Well,
shatters the illusion of a static person.
he calls it, well, to use the words that he specifically uses, he calls it the unessential changeable aspect. Now, when he says unessential, that's tongue in cheek, because it really is essential in the end, and we're going to see that, like, it is inherently part of it. But it's our mind treats it as unessential, contingent, changeable existence. Maybe we could use a cleaner, sort of more compact word like the uh, the transitory self or something, um, as opposed to the unity of self, or the form of self, if you will. That might be an easier way to sort of talk about it.
So is the transitory self superior to the other self?
No, it's neither superior or inferior. They're both at an equal level with each other, and they necessitate each other.
Then how can this be analogous to God?
Well, that's why I said it's not a perfect analogy, because obviously in the Christian story, God is like, creation is a contingent act, right? But like, you could sort of view it in under the guise of like the individual trying to cut itself off from another form of being, um, which it needs in order to even have itself, so to speak. I guess maybe if you wanted to talk about the Trinity, you could also say that, like, the Trinity has like, because it is inherently personal and also relational, um, that like God couldn't have all those other attributes of love without it, so to speak. So there is like that necessary relation, and to privilege one over the other completely negates one, right? Because you can't have father without son, for instance. Um, if there were to be, you need that relation. Every single one implies the other, and the Holy Spirit or whatever leads you to those other two. Um, so I get that. That actually probably be a better analogy, the Trinity. But I was also just thinking in terms of like Luciferianism, so to speak, right? Like, oh well, I don't need God because I'm my own unity of self, or whatever. That's more of like it's a more dramatic example, so to speak. But that is not a perfect example. A more probably a better example to show the sort of symbiotic relation would probably be the Trinity. So, with that said, did I even finish reading this one? No, I didn't. Um, the logic here then means that the universal becomes lost from the attempt to grasp it without its otherness, and this denial of otherness, which it has as its independence from making it really distinct in identity, thus destroys its identity, and once again produces this alienation. Identity needs individuality. It needs to be itself and not other. But for this to be the case, the other must exist actually, and the denial of one leads to the denial of the other. This is not merely the inner movement of self. Oh, I read this already. Okay. Um, anyway, this is just going back into how the conditions for one particular imply the existence of other particulars, but also at the same time, uh, it's not as if the relation gives rise to the terms either, because that doesn't make sense, because you need to have the terms first to have the relations. It's more so that terms themselves are inherently relational. Um, and the existence of relation is inescapable. But well, I don't know if I should go into Bradley, because this is not whatever. If you want to get sort of, if you're listening to this and your intuition is telling you that something is a little off with that, um, logically speaking, where, well, okay, if terms are prior to relations, but the terms themselves are dependent on relations, but relations can't give rise to terms, then you are correct, and you're beginning to see the illusory nature of appearance, as F.H. Bradley would put it. But that's far beyond the scope of this text, and I don't want to confuse anybody. That's just me reading other things and projecting it onto this, or noticing it in this, in a way, or not noticing it in this, but using it in relation to this. Anyway, continuing on. Uh, in its denial of its individual expression, its presence in work and enjoyment, which is the individuated form of its essential being. And by individuated form of its essential being, we just take that as uh, its own independence reflected through its creations. Um, these individuals become mere particularities, since in their denial they no longer refer to anything universal, and thus they become self imploding in a way. Yeah, I read this already. Okay. Uh, Okay, so I got the last two here to read. This denial of otherness or individuality is denial on behalf of the unchangeable universal, and in this sense, reflects its unity with it. It is always there, always will be, and is inescapable because of this. This is the truth of its reality and its ontological inescapability. Its negative attitude to the individual is its positive recognition of the universal in relation to it. This relation between the two is thus a relation between an antithesis of two extremes of universal and individual, essential in itself to the unessential consciousness of individuality. However, their mediation is what allows them existence, and their distinctness or independence is found in each other, which is the mediation that has a middle term. Universal needs Universal needs its individual expression to be universal over, or else it cannot exist uh, as that beyond of them all, and the individual needs the universal to be a concrete reflection of its likeness. They are extremities only insofar as they are extremities for each other. This middle term is itself consciousness. As the mediator, it shows both extremes to one another and relates them therein. It says one is for the other, and in being for the other, they can have themselves. They are in themselves to be, let's see here, related to another. If lacking in relating to the other, they end up losing themselves. And if not having unity of themselves, they cannot be related as positive terms to one another. This relation, however, can only be through consciousness, which holds within itself the truth of both as the mediation between the two. Here we start to see the hint to reason as that which can relate consciousness to the reality of spirit as such. It is nested. Yeah, see, I'm just kind of pointing here, like this little paragraph, because this is at the end of the chapter here. He's sort of pointing to the fact that consciousness itself is this mediating thing which allows reality, or the reality outside itself of object, to exist as notional form through which it can work itself through and bring itself in back in relation and unity with the reality it's nested within. Um, anyway, the middle term is the moving beyond unhappy consciousness and the renunciation of its third movement, and now the recognition of the mutual necessity between the two, as seen in its mediation in the unity of the consciousness, which sees both as necessary and is therefore the mediator. It is a priestly consciousness which unites individuality to particularity in the recognition of both as communing with one another. So now we see here we're kind of coming to a positive, so to speak, destruction of the unhappy consciousness. There's one thing I want to mention before I go into this. Hegel kind of see, and this is the thing with Hegel, right? Because he will drop what the youth will call the truth nuke, but he won't, like, you'll have to figure it out a little bit on your own. And that is kind of like, people talk about the phenomenology. It's a little condensed in a certain respect because he's not doing all the work for you. You have to do a little bit of the work yourself. That's just why people say the science of logic should be read first. But we just see here that regarding its ontological inescapability, meaning that when it wants to, when the consciousness wants to not focus on the individual and only focus on the universal, in doing that, it's sort of implying this the inescapability of the relation, and also the inescapability of this sort of universal, all-encompassingness. It's kind of like saying, well, I want this over the other, is implying the existence of, quote, this, as well. And that's also what he's saying. So the unhappy consciousness itself, because it does have this desire to bridge the gap, so to speak, between the two, is the desire stems at a certain point from the recognition of the reality of both. But the actual mature and complete understanding is to see that will both necessitate each other. Can't have universal without particular. Can't have particular without universal. Universal is, in a certain sense, a kind of particular, and particulars are, in a kind of sense, also a universal, because they're in their particularity, they are universally particular, and in the universality, right? It is particularly universal. Also, the universal, to be universal, must be universal over something, and what it is universal over or in relation to is particularity, right? Because how could you really say something is universal unless it exists everywhere? You can't. That's what it means to be universal. And how could you say something is particular if it's not a particular instance of a thing. Um, so that's why they necessitate one another. But the matured consciousness here is this mediating, and Hegel calls it the priestly consciousness. Why does he call it the priestly consciousness? Well, he's making a analogy here. The unchangeable, essential, universal, all-encompassing, all-powerful self is almost like God, so to speak, and the individual is sort of, um, at least directly in terms of experience, contingent thing. And the mediating consciousness unites the two by saying, well, you need this to be yourself. You need the unchangeable to be an individual of it, because to be an individual of it implies it, and vice versa. And that's sort of, now, of course, if you were to really make this analogous to God or something, you would probably be implying, and maybe Snout, you can help me here because I'm a little rusty on my knowledge of theological schools, but what is it, Calvinism that believes in the necessity of creation? I can't remember which Protestant sect.
I'm not sure about the necessity of creation. That I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, there's one Protestant sect that believes that creation is necessary, and I can't remember which one it is. Whatever, it doesn't matter. I don't want to get too lost in theological analogies. Let's just focus on, like priests themselves, right? There's pagan priests that also believed in. I believe Aristotle believed in the necessity of creation. Um, so anyway, continuing on here, but we're now seeing a new phase of consciousness, one that recognizes the symbiotic relation and therefore necessary relation of both of those things, the individual and particular aspects of self-consciousness. Um, in its recognition, the mediating or priestly consciousness views its own work and action as one side of the extremes of the side of its individuality. And here, the mediating consciousness sees this work and action as immersed in a greater whole outside its individual expression. But the work as such is still left behind to the individual or unessential consciousness. It is its own particular work and enjoyment, which in the end does refer back to the unchangeable, but it is not its fullness. It takes these actions in themselves to be the actions of its particularity that is not necessarily fully in line with the, let's see here, universal or conforming to being one with it. It is in this sense that mediating consciousness, which holds within itself the fullness of recognition of both, can minister to the individual what is and is not in line with the unchangeable, as it knows the place of it in relation to individuality. And in doing this, ministering, it is doing the act of maintaining the relation and its unity. Mediating consciousness does not take enjoyment in its own action for its own individuality, but rather would find joy in the denial of its particular self in favor of the action of what is in line with the essence of the unchangeable essential. And it is, in this sense, sacrificial, and in being for it is the work of that essentiality. It renounces the enjoyment of its actions in part because, in attaining the truth of its independence, it knows that these things as dependent on something else and not fully non-relational or absolute. And this is seen concretely in fasting or sacrifice. It is in this self-denial that it is undergoing the recognition of one extreme, but only through its presence as sacrifice of the enjoyment of the other meaning the individual, of course. So this is interesting, right? So the priestly consciousness at this point, which wants to sort of bridge the gap between the unity, or sorry, bridge the gap between the unchangeable and the changeable. What does it do to do that? Well, it simply can't have the work be its own work for its own self necessarily, its own individual self, that is. It needs to be a work for the greater whole of both. Now, you could look at this in a religious sense, but I think a probably better concrete way of looking at it is actually something we all do. Um, think about it, right? You often, maybe you'll say to yourself, I should stop smoking cigarettes because that's not good for me in the long term. So I'm going to deny myself the enjoyment of smoking a pack of cigarettes for my own uh, my own benefit. When you do that, what are you doing? You're denying your individual self in this particular moment the enjoyment of the cigarette, so that you, as a whole, your unchangeable universal I, self as such, across time, will be better off. Um, and those individual selves will also be better off. And in doing this sacrifice, you're sort of you're sacrificing something in relation to yourself as such. You're saying, okay, Gabriel, you better stop smoking because it's not good for Gabriel. But in saying it's not good for Gabriel, you're saying it's not good for the self as such in this case. And um, and then what is stopping the smoking is the individual self in that moment, the concrete self, if you will. That's probably, I would say, a better way to look at this than in a religious sense, because when you start looking at it in a religious sense, even though those kinds of things are related to religion, of course, but when you begin looking at it in a religious sense, it makes it more not convoluted, but just more complicated, I should say. So, but this priestly consciousness is almost a sort of disciplined consciousness, one that recognizes me in the here and now, but also me as such. One that is willing to deny the self in the here and now for the good of the self as a whole through its entire life. Um, and in doing that, in that relation, what's implied in there is the extremities of both, but those extremities of both being for one another. Why? Because the individual, if it does something bad, negatively impacts the sort of experience of that self throughout time. Um, and the self, of course, throughout time, always refers back to a self as such. Um, so that I would say is is the most concrete way to look at this particular priestly consciousness, if you will. Uh, in its moments of surrender, first with its surrendering of its own willing, and rather its willing only toward the unchangeable, and then as an extension, its cessation of the joy of its own work and actions, and instead joy in sacrificing for that which it recognizes itself as the mediation of the unchangeable. And in this sacrifice, it surrenders its inner freedom and sees itself as determined from outside itself, and its essence, therefore, outside itself. It thus loses the strength of its I or selfhood, and in doing so, it has become an object of a higher existence, and an object, as it is in the externalizing of a subject, is therefore not free, as its essence is not self contained. Its fundamental derivation is seen through this recognition concretely made in sacrifice. The act of sacrifice is, however, still the concrete subsistence of this mediating consciousness, and in some sense not fully lost in the sense that it recognizes itself as the particular self who is doing the sacrifice, and thus necessary for the relation of such to occur, and also itself is still affirmed in those outward possessions it has not sacrificed. There's an element of its own particularity it cannot exchange for. If it did, it would then be filled up or subsumed into something that was not itself, and thus would be meaningless for its own particular existence as the mediator or priestly consciousness. Its personhood must be somewhat preserved. So, a couple things here. Um, when it sacrifices itself, it's doing two things. It's of course sacrificing itself for itself in the individual for itself as such, right? And in doing that, of course, it's recognizing. Well, it's recognizing both, but it's chiefly recognizing the self as such. But um, it has to be a little careful with that. It can't sacrifice everything, because if it were to sacrifice everything, it would then sort of destroy its individuality, so to speak, or or look away from its individuality and deny it. If it denies its individuality, we already know what's going to happen, as we've constantly seen through this chapter. It's going to lose its ability to even have the unity of self. So, to a certain extent, Hegel is saying, well, okay, you need to make sacrifices to recognize this higher self, but you can't sacrifice everything, because if you did that, then you would then again turn your head away from the recognition of individuality as a whole, and you would then lose individuality and then fall over into one-sided being. So you need to preserve a little bit, but you also do need to have the sacrifice, because the sacrifice itself acts as a bridge between the two. Um,
Why is it called the higher self if it's co-equal?
well, he's not saying it's the higher self per se, but he's saying it's what we consider the higher self, psychologically, so to speak. And you could also like, and the reason that is because it's the higher self that's like higher in the sense that it's it's beyond the particular ones, and we sort of view it. We kind of put it on a pedestal because of that. Like logically speaking, they're not. One is not higher, one is not lower. It's a psychological thing, I would say, um, instead of a logical thing per se. Um, so yeah, so sacrifice itself also has to have a sort of balance within, or else it loses its ability. The sacrifice of unessential consciousness toward the essential is, in some sense, the cessation of its own misery, because in doing so, it finally achieves some communion with it. However, there's still more work left to do. The negative relation or one sided action is actually only action insofar as the positive existence of the other is what it is in and for it. It is only negative viewed from one side of the relation without the other, but in the other it is full and has its essence to be for it. Which is to say, the sacrifice of unessential consciousness is a sacrifice toward the essential, and in doing so, this is its misery seen in alienation is somewhat halted, as it now actively recognizes it whilst also recognizing itself as that which is doing the recognizing. And thus recognizing the will to which its own is sacrificing toward, it begins to see that will in its essentiality as the universal one, and its own as a particular in relation to it. It is universal in that it is other for consciousness, um, but also in that in that it is universally other for consciousness. When it sees its negative relation in otherness, to this it implicitly posits the positivity of its universal will. And so, in other words, it is derivative from its actuality, and in being derived, it is other and not it. Consciousness does not yet see here through that, though that is the derivation in relation is itself positive, and therefore, in being the expression of the essential itself essential. Uh, oh, yeah. So, in being expression of the essential, it is essential, which is to say that if something comes from a necessary thing, so to speak, there is an element of, well, it's necessarily part of it to do this because of the sort of coexistence aspect for Hegel. Um, so, as what is, let me just read this here, as what is essentially necessarily expresses itself in its own essential nature. If in order that it is essential, it must be contrasted with the unessential. Its unessential is essential to the identity of essentiality. And since this truth is the truth of the essence of the essential, it is self contained and its freedom. Since it does not yet recognize that its sacrifice is in principle by virtue of its relation to unity, it cannot fully resolve its misery, even in the consciousness of the mediator. So, a couple things here. Its misery being sort of solved here. He's talking about the misery of the unhappy consciousness, the desire for unity, and the inability to grasp that unity is that misery. And it's somewhat solved by this priestly sort of consciousness, this sacrificing of things of the here and now for a better tomorrow and a better just forever for the self. Creates enough, somewhat of a cessation of this. But there's also something here that we need to I kind of missed, but I want to talk about it one more time. Yes, the freedom aspect, right? So because this individual self is obviously contingent upon another, well, the unchangeable necessary self, so to speak. It's not free because his essence is relational. Um, but the and for something to be free for Hegel, right? He says a free thing has its essence self-contained. Um, but the freedom of the whole of the self is that it's self-relating, so to speak. So if you were to view one thing without the other as free, it would actually be a faux freedom, an immature freedom, because it wouldn't be in that it would, looking at it from one side therefore implies the other side implies it's not free. But if you were to look at it as a whole, then okay, you could say it's free because at that point its essence is self-relational. Um, and so that's also what he's getting at there. Um, and the essential, insofar as it has its unessential element, that unessential should be read in quotes. Why? Because the unessential is the essential expression or it is the expression of the essential. And if it is the expression of the essential, there is something essential about it, because you know a cause always reflects, or sorry, an effect always reflects its cause in a way. Um, so even here Hegel's saying, well, look, yes, the individual, which was psychologically taken to be uh, unessential only because it viewed itself as one-sided in relation to the other without actually recognizing the necessary expression of the other side, isn't freedom, because it is inherently derivative. But if we come to understand that, well, the the essence of the essential in this case is to express itself through individuality, well, then we begin to look at individuality as also essential for the essential, so to speak. And that's how we get this sort of logic of communion or coexistence between the two. Um, and that is, that's sort of recognized through sacrifice for the self. But it's still, it doesn't fully get there, Hegel says. And I think the reason he was saying this is because um, there's still a juxtaposition, so to speak. It's never fully resolved in the way that the unhappy consciousness wants it to be resolved. And I think there's also something I should mention here, because I think a lot of people, when they read Hegel, or specifically the phenomenology of spirit, they look at the book and they think, well, when I get out of every stage and I understand the logic of it, well, then I'm done with it. I don't need to think about the stage anymore, and that consciousness sort of supersedes it. Uh, but that's not necessarily true, because uh, even when I'm thinking about these things myself, our actual daily existence, we do tap into these different levels at a certain point. At certain points, we subconsciously prefer the individual over the self as such. Um, but that logic, that inner logic, is always there for us to tap into, and that's of course the notion for Hegel, that inner logic of the relation between these two and therefore reality. Um, so let's. I don't know if did I read this second paragraph here. I'm just going to read it again. Uh, I don't think I did though. It still sees its sacrifice as that of action of an individual, but not yet individual for universal. And in this, it is still incomplete. The unity of objectivity with its being for self has not yet become notion for consciousness, as it has not seen the inner logic of the fact it relates to actual positivity and not merely an absolute beyond. It is not seen that the object of action, oh sorry, yet the object of action is the object for an essence. In other words, the action or sacrifice of the individual consciousness of the mediator is not fully aware that its action is its own object, which has its object as the positive expression of the essential of itself, and thus fails to see that in principle its sacrifice is not merely, or sorry, that in principle that its sacrifice is not absolute, but is an object for a positive essence, and not merely an object sacrificed for some beyond which it is derived from. It is here that the mediating consciousness, in its certainty of itself as a necessary mediation between the two, and as an individual which has for itself action and sacrifice, thus takes itself as it can in with reason as absolute and all reality. That this individual action refers to the universal in its sacrifice. But since the sacrifice is of the individual and is its own, and for it, and that this individual must exist as a relation or mediation between the two extremes, that it is itself absolute concrete reality by virtue of its necessity and sacrifice, and thus its misery and action are pitiable and somewhat in vain. And in being in vain, it is because it only sees the negative aspect of its sacrifice and does not see that this is a sacrifice to a positive essentiality, and it is not unified, and instead takes it as what it takes what it is sacrificing as merely other and beyond the particular sacrifice. But it does not see that this nullifies it, because if the sacrifice is not truly oriented toward a positive unity, then it isn't fully a sacrifice making it a kind of vanity. Therefore, its misery is only halted, but not fully, as in its own taking its individuality as absolute, it becomes narcissistic and vain. So that's a lot, but this is another key movement here. Um, basically, so the mediating priestly consciousness, which is able to sort of relate the individual sort of self to the universal self of a particular person. Once it begins to understand, oh, okay, well, this mediating consciousness, I'm necessary for this relation. I'm the middle term between the two that unites the two. And if I wasn't here, then the two actually couldn't exist because the two need each other. And I'm the realization of this necessary need for one another. But then it does this same thing again. It takes itself now as, I'm the absolute, of course. And then of course Hegel's going to say, well, no, you're not the absolute. You're just actually you're part of an absolute. You're another necessary component in the components and the among the other necessary components of the whole relation. But it doesn't realize this, of course. It takes itself as this kind of absolute thing by virtue of its necessary mediation. And this is sort of well, a couple things. That's the beginning of reason, because reason is, for Hegel, it's the ability to know the self through its unity and multiplicity and back to its unity and the whole movement of this, right? And we begin to see that with this mediating consciousness that's able to recognize the self in the world of flux and the self as such. But in doing that, it begins to privilege itself. And because of that, well, what does that say about its sacrifices? Well, if its sacrifices are for an absolute, and it takes itself now as the absolute, then its sacrifices are really just for itself. But if it's for itself, then these sacrifices, I mean, is it really a sacrifice at that point? Because if to sacrifice something is to give yourself over to otherness. But if you're not really giving yourself over to otherness and you're giving yourself just to your own individuality, you're not really doing a proper full sacrifice. It's a somewhat of a sacrifice because it does recognize otherness, but it then recognizes itself as absolute and the sacrifice in some sense for itself. So it is not completely, but a little vain in that regard. And therefore, if it's a little vain, it's still problematic because there shouldn't be any of that if we want to reach a complete, absolute sense of knowing, of course. So, and I think I read this, but it's probably worth reading again.
Sorry, what page are we on?
On my notes,
Yeah.
it's 31. We have one more page left. I mean, we're really
Oh,
almost done. Yeah. So this is going to probably be like just an hour.
that's fine.
So, and in being in vain, it is because it only sees the negative aspect of its sacrifice and does not see that this is a sacrifice to a positive essentiality, that it is not unified and instead takes what it is sacrificing as merely other and beyond the particular sacrifice. But it does not see that this nullifies it, because if the sacrifice is not truly oriented toward a positive unity, then it isn't fully a sacrifice, making it vanity. Therefore, its misery is only halted, but not fully, as in taking its individuality as absolute, it becomes narcissistic and vain. So this is also part of the problem. As being the mediating term between the unchangeable and the changeable self, and therefore privileging itself, it kind of sees these aspects through which it's mediating as a kind of beyond. Well, these are beyond me, it says to itself. These are, yes, they're necessary, but like ultimately they are there for me to be me. It's like, okay, well, if that's the case, if they are this sort of beyond, if you're kind of just relating, only looking at them in a negative sense, only looking at them in relation to yourself and how you're not them, but beyond them, and in some sense higher than them, you're not actually really grappling with these things as positive essentialities, which is what they are supposed to be. Because if they weren't, then you couldn't exist for your own positive essentiality as well, because you're derived of your for your existence by these two poles. But also, those two poles do need you to unify them in a certain sense. So it's once again, it's the whole thing about one-sidedness and viewing the other as totally negative and having no positive essentiality whatsoever. It also undermines the existence of the self. And over here, I add a little bit of a qualification, and this is pretty much where the chapter ends. To qualify, the mediator is correct in taking its expression between the two as the necessary expression of the essential. But in doing this, it makes the mistake of treating that necessary expression as the same as the essence in itself. Then, in seeing its concrete individuality as a necessary expression of the essential, it assumes that necessity of the essential as such as its own and its sacrifice becomes a sacrifice in the end, not for anything else but itself. Hence, it is in vain and not a true cessation of the misery, but instead latent failure to halt it. This unchangeable is now treated as mere beyond, but in doing so, it once again cuts itself off, and in order to ground its sacrifice, it assumes that the sacrifice of its own action is oriented toward the universal, which it takes itself to be that individual necessary expression. So we see two layers here. The mediated individual is taken as a necessary essence itself mistakenly, and furthermore, this makes the actual essence lost again, and the sacrifice is not handed to a positive unity outside itself, but only an otherness undefined. And in doing so, and in doing this, the sacrifice becomes void and self-serving for the own elation of the individual, making it whom he conflates with being absolute. Sacrifice cannot be for oneself, since sacrifice is for another, but it is here mistakenly done so, and thus only a superficial cessation of misery. So there is a little bit of closure here, of course, because we wouldn't be moving on to the next section or ending the chapter here if there wasn't some closure. We understand the closure insofar as the necessity of the two for each other, their coexistence, and also their middle term, which mediates the two, bridges the two, and sort of unifies them in a concrete sense, right? The mediating priestly consciousness is the concrete expression of the unity because it's the double-sided recognition. But then that too falls into a problem where it begins to take its own reasoning through both as an absolute. But if it is an absolute, and it says it's sacrificing for the absolute, so to speak, then its sacrifice becomes for itself, and it doesn't recognize that it's really taking a very vain position. Let me just see if there's anything else I should add here before we kind of close it off. Yeah, I mean, well, essentially, the problem is taking its relation as absolute. It's another form of this sort of vanity. But as I said before, there is a little bit of a halting toward misery. I think the last thing I do want to talk about here, though, is how this, later we're going to see this is going to tie into reason, because the ability to mediate between the abstract and the concrete, which is what the mediating consciousness is doing, because the unchangeable is as abstract, which let's not forget, abstract doesn't mean fake. It just means not concrete, and it still has true reality. And the individual, the divided expression through time is the concrete expression. Because the mediating consciousness is able to sort of relate these two, reason between the two. This is now the birth of the reason section, the reason sort of, where consciousness says, well, I can sit on my throne and reason through everything, and I can take that as what it means to be absolute. But of course, that itself is going to be problematic, and we'll probably get into that in sometime during the summer or something. So I don't know. Is there any last thoughts? Anything you want to say, add, or talk about? Or
Yeah, I'm glad we're done with this for now.
yeah, no, I don't blame you. This is look, and we've said this before. If the minority of people sticking through with this stuff, proud of you, because it's not easy. It's very grueling work, but it's rewarding once you get to know it. It's funny. I know I have a guy who asked me once. He's like, "Well, like, isn't this just like a big waste of time?" And I hate that question, not because it's like offends me or something, but because I just think it's a stupid question. A waste of time. Like, okay, if my goal was to build a house or become a real estate agent or something, yeah, reading the phenomenology of spirit isn't really going to help me. I mean, maybe it'll help me relate to my clients better or something, and realize I couldn't be a real estate agent unless I had clients to be real estate agents for, but like, okay, but then like, yeah, of course it's going to be a waste of time. But like,
but that's like something you think of when you're 5 years old, right?
yeah, were you talking about that meme where girls are like,
Yeah.
this? Yeah, I love that too. I would love to see like, Well, and to be but okay, to be fair to those girls posting those TikToks, they're probably like it's probably some like dog shit philosopher that someone posted that never really said anything profound, or maybe like an oversimplification of something actually very rich in meaning that they then whatever. Because a lot of philosophical thoughts certainly are thoughts we've all had before, but what philosophers do is they take those thoughts and they work them through their inner logic more and more and more. I mean, that's what Hegel's doing. Because I think everybody who's watching this, if you had a hard time with everything in this video, I'm sure you could at least understand or have at least thought once in your life, well, am I really the same person as I was yesterday? Because yesterday was different. Like the me from yesterday was different from the me from today. Those are two different people in a certain way, in a certain sense, because they existed in two different locations in two different times, right? You begin to have like a sort of existential questioning of yourself. Hegel's talking about that, but he's going a step further with it. And he's saying, well, this is where this leads when we think it through. And of course, no, Diddy Floyd is going to be doing that anytime soon. So I don't think any philosophy bros don't have anything to worry about when it comes to people saying, "Oh, you're what you thought I thought a long time ago." I actually had a girl say this to me the other day. She said, "Hegel figured out what us girls have always known for centuries." I'm like, "Oh God, okay." Yeah. I'm sure you thought of the unhappy consciousness and the mediating consciousness. But yeah. Anyway, I'll end it here. Nice and short today. And this is closure on the self-consciousness section.
Bye. Bye bye.